The boy in room 14 hadn't spoken in 3 days. His wrist was shattered, his ribs were taped, and the man coming to take him home tonight was the same man who put him there. Nobody in that hospital was going to stop it. Nobody who worked there anyway. Eli Hayden was 9 years old. He lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling, tiles counting them for the 217th time. 217 white squares with tiny black holes arranged in a grid that never changed no matter how many times he counted. The clock on the wall said 4:47. Troy would come at 6. The doctor would sign the papers. Eli would go home. He knew this the way you know the sun will rise. Not because anyone told him, because 3 days in this room had taught him everything he needed to know about who mattered and who didn't. His left wrist throbbed under the brace. The bandage over his right eyebrow itched. The tape around his ribs pulled tight every time he breathed. But none of it hurt as much as knowing that in 1 hour and 13 minutes, Troy Hayden would walk through that door, and this time there would be no back porch steps to blame it on. This time there wasn't even a back porch. Eli closed his eyes. The cartoon on the TV played at low volume, bright voices, selling cereal and toys to children who still believed in things like fairness and protection. He'd stopped believing in those things around the time his wrist snapped, maybe before. The door was partially open. He could see a slice of the hallway. Nurses walked by in scrubs the color of the sky before a storm. Someone pushed a meal cart that rattled and squeaked. A phone rang at the nurse's station, then stopped. Nobody looked in. 3 days, and the only people who came into his room were the ones paid to check his pulse and bring him food he couldn't eat. The nice nurse with the dark hair had been different. She'd looked at him the way his teacher used to look at him before he stopped going to school. Like she saw something. But even she couldn't stop what was coming. Eli opened his eyes and went back to counting ceiling tiles. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere across the city, a Harley-Davidson rumbled through the October afternoon, heading towards St. Michael Hospital with a man who had no idea his life was about to change. Kane Mercer pulled into the hospital parking lot at 4:51 on a Tuesday that felt like the end of something. The sky over Tulsa had turned the color of old pewter, and the wind carried the first real bite of winter. He cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, his left forearm wrapped in a grease-stained shop rag held together with electrical tape. The gash wasn't deep enough to kill him, he'd had worse, but it was deep enough to need stitches, and at 64 years old, Kane Mercer knew the difference between a wound that would close on its own and one that wouldn't. He swung his leg off the bike and stood to his full height. 6'3", 220 pounds, most of it earned through decades of hard living and harder choices. The Hells Angels patch on the back of his cowhide vest caught the pale afternoon light. The death's head grinning at anyone who looked too long. 2 women walking toward the entrance saw him and stopped. One touched the other's arm. They changed direction, giving him a wide arc, and disappeared through the automatic doors without looking back. Kane barely noticed. He'd stopped noticing that reaction a long time ago. In the inside pocket of his vest, folded in thirds, was a piece of paper that mattered more than the cut on his arm. He'd gotten it 2 weeks ago. Read it once, put it away. Hadn't looked at it since. The paper said small cell carcinoma. Stage 2A, treatment recommended. Prognosis, 60%, 5-year survival if addressed immediately. Kane had an appointment with an oncologist next Wednesday. He'd written it down on a napkin that was probably still in his kitchen, under a coffee mug, next to the ashtray he kept telling himself he'd throw away. But today wasn't about cancer. Today was about 8 stitches, maybe 10, in and out in 20 minutes. He walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical sigh, and the smell hit him like a fist. Antiseptic, floor wax, that particular chemical sweetness hospitals used to cover the smell of sickness and fear. It was the same smell from 8 years ago, when he'd sat in a room just like this one, while doctors told him there was nothing more they could do for Beth. Nothing more we can do. As if they'd been doing something. As if 3 rounds of chemotherapy that turned his wife into a ghost had been anything other than borrowed time with interest. Kane pushed the memory down and kept walking. The waiting room was half full. 4 rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a television mounted in the corner playing a muted cooking show, fluorescent lights humming overhead like trapped insects. The conversations that had been happening died out one by one as he crossed to the reception desk. The young man behind the desk looked up from his computer screen and went visibly pale. His name tag said Marcus. He couldn't have been more than 20. "I need stitches," Kane said, unwrapping the shop rag enough to show the gash. "Caught it on a chain tensioner." Marcus blinked. His eyes moved from Kane's face to the patch on his vest, to the tattoos that climbed Kane's neck and covered the backs of his hands. Names, dates, images that meant something to Kane and nothing to anyone else. "Of course," Marcus managed. His voice cracked slightly. "I'll need your insurance card and a photo ID." Kane produced both from his wallet without comment. Marcus processed them with hands that trembled just enough to be noticeable. Somewhere to Kane's left, a security guard materialized. Heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a gray mustache and the posture of someone who used to be more formidable than he currently was. His name tag read Don. He positioned himself 6 feet away and didn't try to be subtle about it. Kane didn't acknowledge him. He took his cards back, found a seat in the corner, away from the other patients, and waited. A mother pulled her toddler closer. An old man in a baseball cap stared openly, then looked away when Kane met his eyes. A teenage girl 3 rows up kept glancing back over her phone, curiosity winning out over caution. Kane sat very still and thought about the paper in his pocket. 60% 5-year survival, which meant 40% didn't make it. Coin flip odds. And that was if he started treatment immediately. If he sat through months of poison pumped into his veins, if he let them cut pieces out of him, if he did everything right and got lucky. Beth had done everything right. She'd still died. Kane looked at his hands. The knuckles were scarred from 40 years of fights he'd won and a few he hadn't. The names tattooed across his fingers had faded to blue-green shadows. On the back of his left hand, partially hidden by the bandage, was a small tattoo he'd gotten at 30. 2 words in plain block letters. "Show up." Roy Tasker had shown up. Kane was 11 years old, Pittsburgh summer of 1973. His father had put him in the hospital with 3 broken ribs and a concussion. The official story was a fall down the basement stairs. The real story was a leather belt and a man who drank himself mean 6 days out of 7. Kane spent 5 days in that hospital. His father never came. His mother was gone, had been gone since he was 7, vanished one morning and never looked back. The social worker came twice, asked questions. Kane answered the way he'd been taught to answer them, and left looking dissatisfied but unable to prove anything. On the 6th day, Roy Tasker walked in. Roy was 50 years old, 6'4", 250 pounds with a gray beard and a Hells Angels patch older than Kane. He was a friend of the man who ran the garage where Kane's father sometimes worked. He sat down in the visitor's chair without asking permission and didn't say much of anything. When Kane's father showed up an hour later, Roy stood up. That was all, just stood up. Kane's father took one look at Roy Tasker, at the patch and the scars, and the absolute absence of anything resembling compromise in the man's posture, and left. Roy stayed until the social worker came back. Then he left too. Kane never saw him again. Didn't know where Roy went or why he'd come in the first place. But Roy had shown up, and that had changed everything. 6 months later, Kane was in foster care. 2 years after that, he was patched into a club. Not Roy's club, different city, different chapter. But the same world, the world of men who didn't fit anywhere else and stopped trying. Kane lived that life for 40 years. Good years and bad years and years that didn't qualify as either. He did things he was proud of and things he wasn't, and most of it blurred together into a long stretch of concrete and chrome and the particular freedom that came from not owing anything to anyone. Then he met Beth. Beth Holloway, 38 years old, waitress at a truck stop outside Amarillo. She looked at Kane the way Roy had looked at his father. Not afraid, not impressed, just steady. She saw the patch and the tattoos and the life he carried on his shoulders, and she said, "You look like you could use some coffee that isn't terrible." She was right. He did. They got married 6 months later. Kane left the club not dramatically, not burning bridges, just quietly stepping back the way men do when they find something better. They moved to Tulsa. Kane opened a small garage. Beth worked part-time at a diner and spent the rest of her hours turning their rental house into something that felt like a home. They had 5 years. 5 years, and then the cancer came. Fast and mean and indifferent to anything Beth wanted or deserved. Kane sat beside her through 3 rounds of chemotherapy that bought them 8 extra months. He held her hand through the hospice visits in the morphine haze and the long nights when she couldn't remember his name, but still knew his voice. When she died, Kane stopped talking for a while. Not because he had nothing to say, because there was no one left who mattered enough to say it to. He went back to the garage, fixed bikes, kept to himself. The old club guys checked on him now and then, brought him work, made sure he didn't disappear completely. His brother Lyle called once a month. It was enough. And now there was a piece of paper in his pocket telling him the same thing that had taken Beth was growing inside him. Kane wasn't sure how he felt about that. He wasn't sure he felt anything at all. 32 minutes after he sat down, a nurse appeared at the waiting room door and called his name. She wasn't what he expected, not that he'd been expecting anything. Nora Walsh was about 5'6" with dark brown hair pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck and brown eyes that assessed him with the calm efficiency of someone who had long since stopped letting appearances determine her response to people. She held a clipboard and didn't hesitate as she walked toward him. She didn't glance at the patch on his vest, didn't look at the security guard who was still hovering. She extended her hand. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm Nora. I'll be taking care of you today." He shook it. Her grip was firm. "Kane," he said. She nodded as if his name was just a name and not a test. "Let's get you to a room and take a look at that arm." She led him down a corridor with the brisk confidence of someone who had walked these halls 10,000 times. She asked standard intake questions as they went. When did it happen? How deep did it feel? Any numbness or tingling in the fingers? She listened to his answers and wrote them down without commentary. The exam room was small and bright and smelled like latex and disinfectant. Nora gestured to the bed. Kane sat. She unwrapped the shop rag, carefully examined the wound under the overhead light, and nodded to herself. "You're going to need about 10 stitches, she said. "It's clean. Looks like you washed it out." "Gas station bathroom," Kane said. "Smart." She began preparing the suture kit, snapping on gloves with practiced efficiency. "You're going to feel pinch when the local anesthetic goes in. Tell me if it's too much." "It won't be." She glanced at him then, not nervously, but with a look he couldn't quite read, measuring something. "I believe you," she said. The procedure took 20 minutes. She worked with precise, unhurried movements, and when she was done, she dressed the wound and gave him aftercare instructions in a tone that treated him like an adult capable of following them. He was. "You'll want to keep it dry for 48 hours, she said, snapping off her gloves. "Come back in 10 days to have the sutures removed, or see your regular doctor if you have one." "I don't." "Then come back here." She began making notes on his chart. A moment passed, then another. Kane was about to stand when she spoke again, and this time her voice was different, quieter, stripped of its clinical efficiency, carrying something underneath it that he recognized instinctively as controlled fear. She didn't look up from the clipboard. "Mr. Mercer," she said just above a whisper, "before you leave." A pause. "There's a boy in room 14. Kane looked at her. She kept her eyes on the clipboard. Her pen moved as though she was still writing normal notes, but her jaw was tight, and there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. "Room 14, she said again. "End of this hall left side." Another pause. Longer. "I think he needs someone to see him." Kane sat very still. Nora's hand wasn't shaking, but it also wasn't entirely steady. She finished whatever she was writing, set the pen down with deliberate care, and finally looked at him. "I've tried everything I'm allowed to try," she said quietly. "I've filed reports. I've talked to my supervisor. I've talked to the attending physician. I've called the state." Her voice stayed level, but something in her eyes didn't. "They all say I don't have enough evidence. They say I'm overreacting. They say the family has been through a difficult time and accidents happen." She held his gaze. "But I know what I see, and I see a 9-year-old boy who hasn't spoken in 3 days, whose injuries don't match the story, and whose legal guardian is coming to take him home tonight." Kane didn't say anything. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Nora continued, "except that people who look like you don't get ignored the way people like me do, and I'm out of options." She picked up her clipboard, gave him a professionally neutral nod, and walked out. Kane sat in the exam room for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Then he stood up, put on his vest, and turned left. The corridor was quieter at this end of the wing. The nursing station was positioned near the center of the hall, and by the time Kane reached the far end, The ambient noise of the hospital had faded to something almost like silence. Room numbers counted down on the doors to his left. 16, 15, 14. He stopped. The door to room 14 was partially open. Through the gap, he could see the edge of a hospital bed and the pale blue curtain that divided the room. He could hear faintly the sound of a television, a cartoon by the sound of it, bright voices and exaggerated sound effects. Kane pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The boy was sitting up in the bed, small and very still against the white sheets. He looked to be about 9, just like Nora had said, small for his age with dark hair and circles under his eyes that belonged on someone much older. His left arm was in a brace. There was a bandage over his right eyebrow. His face beneath the fluorescent pallor was a map of recent damage. Fading yellows and greens along one cheekbone, a sutured cut above the ear. The boy looked at Kane. Kane looked at the boy. He waited for the kid to flinch or cry or call out. He was used to that reaction from children. Hell, he was used to it from adults. He was used to being the thing in the room that people wanted to get away from. The boy didn't flinch. He just looked at him with eyes that were dark and very old and very careful. "Hey," Kane said. "Hey," the boy said back. His voice was quiet, flat, the voice of someone who had used up all his energy just getting through the day and had none left for inflection. "What are you watching?" Kane asked. The boy glanced at the television. "I don't know, it was on." He looked back at Kane. "Are you a biker?" "Yeah." "Like a real one, with a club?" "Yeah." The boy seemed to consider this. "Cool," he said, with the specific flatness of a child who had lost the energy for genuine enthusiasm but was still trying to produce the appropriate response. Kane pulled the visitor's chair from the corner of the room and sat down. It was too small for him, the plastic seat groaning under his weight, but he sat in it anyway. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eli." "Eli what?" "Hayden." "I'm Kane." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the boy with the same steady attention Nora had given him 20 minutes ago. "Those injuries," Kane said. "How'd they happen, Eli?" The boy looked at the television. "I fell," he said. The words came out pre-formed, automatic, the way a line from a memorized script comes out without the micro-hesitations of actual memory. Kane had heard that particular tone of voice before. He'd used it himself once a very long time ago in a different hospital. "Okay," he said. He didn't push. He sat back in the chair. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 3 days. "Anybody been to visit you?" A pause that lasted 1 beat too long. "My stepdad came yesterday." "What about your mom?" Eli's jaw moved. Something flickered behind his eyes and was gone just as fast. "She's in the hospital too," he said quietly. "Different hospital." His voice didn't break, but it thinned. "She got hurt too, when I fell." Kane was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a cloud moved across what was left of the afternoon light, and the room dimmed slightly. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in its steady, indifferent rhythm. "Is your stepdad coming back today?" Kane asked. "Tonight, maybe." Eli's hands were very still on the blanket. "He said he'd come after work. He's going to talk to the doctor about taking me home." Something moved behind the boy's eyes. Not anticipation, the opposite of anticipation. Fear, yes, but something else too. Resignation, the bone-deep knowledge that nothing was going to change and no one was going to help, and this was just how things were. Kane knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror 53 years ago. He stood up. "I'll be right back," he said. Eli nodded once and turned his attention back to the television, where cartoon characters chased each other through a world where nobody got hurt and everything always worked out fine in the end. Kane walked back down the corridor, past the nursing station, past the waiting room, and out into the parking lot. The air was colder now. The sun had dropped below the buildings to the west, and the sky had gone from pewter to charcoal. Kane stood beside his Harley and pulled out his phone. His brother answered on the third ring. The background noise of a garage was audible behind his voice. The hiss of a pneumatic wrench, a radio playing low. "Kane," Lyle said, "what's up?" "I need a favor." A brief silence. Lyle Mercer had left the club 11 years ago. Quietly, no drama, no sides. He ran an auto shop now in Broken Arrow, had a wife and 2 kids, and a yard with a trampoline. It was a life that made no sense when held next to Kane's, and Kane had never said so out loud, but he respected the hell out of his brother for building it. What kind of favor? Lyle asked carefully. The legal kind, Kane said. There's a kid in this hospital, St. Michael, room 14, 9 years old. Name's Eli Hayden, showing injuries consistent with abuse. Attending physician cleared it as accidental. State says they'll send someone in 3 to 5 business days. He paused. Stepdad's coming tonight to take him home. Silence on the other end. The pneumatic wrench stopped. Kane, I know. You can't just... I know, Kane said again. That's why I'm calling you. You still talk to Brennan. Brennan, the guy Lyle went to high school with who ended up in the district attorney's office. They played poker twice a month and their kids went to the same school. Another silence. Longer this time. Yeah, Lyle said finally. I still talk to Brennan. I need him to make a call that actually moves things, Kane said. Not 3 to 5 business days. Tonight. Kane, you know how this is going to look. You're 64 years old with a patch on your back, sitting alone in a hospital room with a 9-year-old boy. I know. They're going to assume, I know, Kane said for the third time, but I'm not leaving. The silence stretched. Kane could hear Lyle breathing, could hear the calculations happening on the other end of the line. Risk, consequence. The cost of getting involved versus the cost of walking away. The mom's at another hospital, Lilo asked. Mercy Regional. Same story, worse injuries. Jesus. Yeah, Lyle exhaled slowly. Brennan owes me. I'll call him. Thanks. Kane. His brother's voice shifted into something that didn't have a clean name. Concern, maybe, or fear. Be careful. Always am. No, you're not. Kane almost smiled. I'll call you later. He hung up and stood in the parking lot for another moment looking at the hospital entrance. The automatic doors slid open and closed as people came and went. None of them looked at him. None of them knew what was happening in room 14 or cared even if they did. Kane thought about the paper in his pocket, the one that said he had maybe 5 years if he was lucky and did everything right. 5 years. Roy Tasker had given him 6 hours. Just 6 hours on a summer afternoon in 1973, and it had changed the entire trajectory of Kane's life. He could give this kid 6 hours. Kane walked back inside. The corridor was even quieter now. Shift change was happening. Nurses moved with purpose, but without urgency. Somewhere a phone rang and went unanswered. Kane reached room 14 and pushed the door open. Eli was exactly where he'd left him. Still sitting up, still watching the television without really watching it. Your stepdad, Kane said as he sat back down in the too small chair. What time does he usually show up? 6 o'clock, Eli said. Sometimes 6:30. Kane checked his watch. 5:47. Okay, he said. Eli looked at him with those old careful eyes. Why are you here? He asked. It wasn't suspicious. Just genuine curiosity. The kind of question that deserved an honest answer. Kane thought about Roy Tasker, about Beth, about the paper in his pocket, and the fact that time was the one thing none of them ever had enough of. Because a long time ago, Kane said slowly, when I was about your age, I was in a hospital room just like this one, and someone showed up. Eli absorbed this. Did it help? He asked. Kane looked at him, at the bandage over his eyebrow, at the brace on his wrist, at the way the boy sat very still, as if stillness was a kind of armor. Yeah, Kane said quietly. It helped. Eli nodded once and turned back to the television. Kane settled into the chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him, and waited for 6 o'clock to come. The next 20 minutes passed in a strange kind of stillness. Kane sat in the plastic chair that wasn't made for a man his size, and Eli lay in the hospital bed that was too big for a boy his age, and together they existed in a pocket of time that felt separate from the rest of the world. The television played. Cartoons gave way to a game show, then to the local news. The volume was low enough that the words blurred into ambient noise. Kane didn't watch. Eli didn't either, really. The boy's eyes were pointed at the screen, but Kane could tell he wasn't seeing it. Around 6:05, a dinner tray arrived, a pale chicken breast that looked like it had been steamed into submission, green beans the color of fatigue, a carton of apple juice, a small cup of fruit cocktail and syrup. The orderly who brought it was a heavy-set man in his 50s with kind eyes and hands that moved with the gentleness of someone who understood that sick children needed more than just food on a tray. He set it down on the bedside table, adjusted the height so Eli could reach it, and smiled. "You doing okay, buddy?" he asked. Eli nodded. The orderly glanced at Kane. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle wariness. He looked back at Eli. "You need anything, you just push that button, all right?" "Okay," Eli said quietly. The orderly left. Kane heard him stop just outside the door, heard the low murmur of voices, probably talking to a nurse, probably mentioning the large man with the Hells Angels patch sitting alone in the room with the 9-year-old. Kane didn't move. Eli picked at his food, ate a few bites of chicken, drank half the apple juice, pushed the tray away. "Not hungry?" Kane asked. Eli shook his head. "You should try to eat something." "I know." The boy's voice was soft. "I just can't." Kane understood that. He'd gone through stretches after Beth died where food felt like an impossible task. The mechanics of chewing and swallowing required energy he didn't have. "That's all right," he said. They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Eli spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet like a small stone dropped into still water. "Do you have any family?" he asked. Kane looked at him. "A brother." "Are you close?" Kane thought about it honestly. "We weren't for a long time. We're getting there." Eli nodded as though this confirmed something he already suspected. "My real dad lives in Tucson," he said. "I haven't seen him since I was 4. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. "He sends birthday cards sometimes. He spelled my name wrong once, with an I instead of an E at the end. He said it without apparent bitterness, just as a data point, a thing that had happened." "How long has your stepdad been around?" Kane asked. 3 years. Eli looked at his bandaged wrist. "Yes, he wasn't like this at first." Kane didn't say anything. He'd heard that story before, knew how it went. The man who seemed fine until he wasn't. The slow erosion of safety. The moment when you realized the person who was supposed to protect you was the one you needed protection from. "He lost his job last spring," Eli continued. His voice had gone even quieter. "After that, things got different." He trailed off. The trail off contained more than the words would have. Kane leaned forward, slightly, elbows on his knees. "Your mom," he said carefully. "How bad is she hurt?" Eli's face did something complicated. A tightening around the eyes, a small movement at the corner of his mouth. "They said she has a broken jaw and her collarbone." He swallowed. "She tried to stop him this time. That's why she got hurt worse." The words came out clinical, factual, as if Eli was reporting on something that had happened to someone else in some other place. "She told me if the police ask, I should say I fell, because if I don't, Troy will hurt her more." Kane felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. Not anger exactly. Anger was too hot, too immediate. This was something else. The quiet, immovable certainty that what was happening in this room was wrong, and that wrong things needed to be made right. "Eli," he said, "look at me." The boy turned his head, met Kane's eyes. "You don't have to protect him," Kane said. "You don't owe him that." "I'm not protecting him." Eli's voice was very small. "I'm protecting my mom." And there it was, the impossible choice that no 9-year-old should ever have to make. Tell the truth and risk worse violence. Stay silent and go home to the man who put you here. Kane had lived through that choice. He knew what it cost. He also knew that sometimes the only way to break that cycle was for someone from outside to step in. Someone who didn't have to make the calculation. Someone who could afford to stand in the way. "You got any tattoos?" Eli asked suddenly, his voice shifting away from the heavy subjects like a bird veering from a window. Kane blinked at the change in direction. Then he understood. The boy needed to talk about something else. Anything else. "Yeah," Kane said. "A few." "Do they mean things?" "Some of them." Eli's gaze moved over Kane's forearms, what he could see of them below the rolled-up sleeves of Kane's shirt. "Which one's your favorite?" Kane considered the question. He had a lot of ink, most of it accumulated over decades. Names of brothers who died. Dates that marked things he didn't talk about. Images that meant something at the time and less now. He pushed up the sleeve on his left arm, carefully mindful of the fresh stitches and the bandage Nora had applied. Just below the gauze on the inside of his forearm was a small tattoo. Plain block letters, no embellishment. "Show up." "I got this one when I was 30, Kane said. Eli leaned forward slightly to see it better. "What's it mean?" "It means most of the time that's all it takes, showing up." "For what?" "For anything that matters." Eli thought about this. His young face was very serious. Did someone show up for you? He asked. Kane nodded. Once, when I needed it. What happened? Kane looked at the boy, at the bandage over his eyebrow, at the careful way he held his injured wrist, at the exhaustion that lived behind his eyes. I was about your age, Kane said slowly, in a hospital room like this, waiting for my father to come back. He paused. Someone showed up, a man I barely knew. He didn't do much, just sat in a chair, refused to leave. Eli went very still. When my father arrived and saw him sitting there, he left. Never came back. Kane's voice was quiet. That man, Roy, he stayed until help came. Changed everything. Did you ever see him again? Eli asked. No, never got to thank him. Kane looked at the tattoo on his arm. So I got this instead. Eli nodded slowly. He seemed to be working something out in his head. Are you showing up for me? He asked. Kane met his eyes. Yeah, he said simply. I am. The boy absorbed this. Then he lay back against the pillows, some of the tension leaving his small shoulders. Okay, Eli said. Just that. Okay. They sat together in the quiet. The television murmured. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside the window, the October sky darkened toward evening. At 6:08, the shift changed. Kane heard it before he saw it. The subtle increase in corridor traffic. New voices at the nursing station. The particular rhythm of people clocking out and people clocking in. Then the door opened and a woman stepped inside. She was compact, early 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of authority that came from years of managing both patients and personnel. She wore scrubs and an ID badge that identified her as Patricia Cross, nurse manager. She took one eye of the scene in room 14 with an expression that moved from surprise to professional alarm in about 2 seconds. Sir, she said, her voice clipped and firm, I'm going to need you to leave this room. Kane looked at her calmly. I'm visiting. You're not listed as a family member or approved visitor for this patient. Kane turned slightly in his chair. Eli, do you want me to leave? The boy shook his head. He says he doesn't mind, Kane said. Patricia's jaw tightened. That's not how this works. You need to leave, or I'll need to call security. All right, Kane said pleasantly. Call security. She blinked. That wasn't the response she'd expected. I'm serious, she said. So am I. Patricia pulled a phone from her pocket and made the call. Kane stayed exactly where he was, sitting in the plastic chair with his hands loose on his knees, the picture of someone who had no intention of going anywhere. 3 minutes later, Don appeared in the doorway, the same security guard from the waiting room. He looked at Kane, looked at Patricia, and seemed to be doing calculations of his own. Sir, Don said, his voice trying for authority and landing somewhere closer to uncertainty. I need you to come with me. Why, you're disrupting hospital operations. I'm sitting in a chair. You're making the staff uncomfortable. Kane raised an eyebrow. Am I making you uncomfortable, Eli? Eli shook his head again, more firmly this time. Kid says he's fine with me being here, Kane said. Don looked at Patricia. Patricia's face was going red. This is inappropriate, she said. You have no authorized reason to be in this patient's room. I'm a concerned citizen, Kane said. You're a liability. Before Kane could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. Dr. Victor Hale, late 50s, silver hair combed back with precision, wearing a white coat over business casual attire. He had the bearing of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any given room. He looked at Kane with the specific contempt of someone who has decided what a person is and has no interest in revising that assessment. I'm Dr. Hale, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of medical authority. This is a medical facility. You have no authorized reason to be in this patient's room, and I'm asking you to leave. Kane stayed seated. I'm visiting a friend. You're interfering with patient care. I'm sitting in a chair. Hale's eyes narrowed. Don't be glib with me. I'm not being glib, Kane said evenly. I'm being literal. I'm sitting in a chair. That's all I'm doing. If you want to call the police and explain to them why you're trying to remove a private citizen from a voluntary conversation, you're welcome to do that. Hale's face reddened. He turned to Eli and his voice shifted into practiced warmth. Eli, he said, the tone of a man performing competence. Are you all right? Is this man making you uncomfortable? Eli looked at Kane. Then he looked at Hale. His young face was very serious. No, he said quietly. I'm okay. A pause. He's my friend. Something flickered across Hale's face, quick, barely visible, the shadow of a calculation being made. He straightened. "I'll be back in an hour," he said to Patricia. "Mr. Hayden should be arriving shortly. Make sure the discharge paperwork is ready." He turned and left without another word. Don remained in the doorway, uncertain. "You can go," Kane told him, not unkindly. "I'm not going anywhere." Don looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Kane. A muscle in her jaw moved. "You're making a mistake," she said. Kane looked at Eli, at the brace on his wrist, at the bandage above his eyebrow, at those dark, careful eyes that were watching everything. "No," Kane said quietly. "I don't think I am." Patricia left. Don followed her. Their voices carried down the hall, low and urgent. Kane could hear them discussing options. Hospital policy. Liability. What to do about the man in room 14 who wouldn't leave. Eli was looking at Kane with something new in his expression. Not quite hope, but maybe the space where hope could grow if given time. "They're really mad," Eli said. "Yeah." "Are you scared?" Kane thought about the question honestly. "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm 64 years old," Kane said. "I've been scared of a lot of things in my life. Hospital administrators aren't on the list." Eli almost smiled. Almost. The clock ticked. 6:15, 6:20, 6:23. Then Kane heard it. Footsteps in the corridor, heavy and deliberate. The walk of a man who was used to a room adjusting itself to accommodate him. Troy Hayden appeared in the doorway at 6:24. He was 43 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a close-trimmed beard going gray at the sides and eyes the flat, pale blue of shallow water. He wore work clothes, Carhartt pants, a canvas jacket with a company logo on the breast. He looked like a contractor or a foreman. He looked, in fact, perfectly ordinary. He saw Kane and stopped. The expression that crossed his face was not fear. It was the expression of a man recalibrating, reassessing a situation he had walked into expecting one set of conditions and finding another. His eyes moved from Kane to Eli and back to Kane. "What is this?" Troy said. His voice was controlled. Practice control, the kind that comes from long habit. "Evening," Kane said. "Who are you, Darian?" "A friend." "Why are you in my son's room?" "Stepson," Eli said quietly from the bed. Troy's gaze snapped to the boy with a speed that was reflexive, and in that fraction of a second before he smoothed it out, Kane saw the thing underneath. The quick, hot anger of a man who was accustomed to having his framings accepted without correction. It was there and gone. But it was enough. Troy looked back at Kane. He assembled a smile piece by piece. "Eli," he said, his voice shifting into something softer. "Buddy, how are you feeling?" "Okay," Eli said. His voice had gone very small. Troy stepped into the room. Not all the way, just far enough to establish presence. "I don't know who you are," he said to Kane, still maintaining that reasonable tone, "but I'm going to need you to leave. This is a private family matter." "I was invited," Kane said. "By who? By Eli?" Troy's jaw shifted. He was doing the math now. Kane could see it, sizing him up, calculating whether to push. He glanced at the Hells Angels patch on Kane's vest. His eyes lingered there for a moment. "Look," Troy said, shifting tones again, going for reasonable man to man. "I don't know what you think you know, but this is none of your business. Eli had an accident. His mother had an accident. These things happen." He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "I know it looks bad. I know how it probably seems to someone looking from the outside, but this family has had a rough year, and we don't need a stranger making things harder." "I'm not making anything harder," Kane said. "I'm just sitting here. I'd like you to leave." "I know." Troy's face went through a rapid internal sequence. Then he straightened, made a decision. "I'm going to get the doctor," he said. He looked at Eli. "Buddy, start getting your things together. We're going home tonight." He left. The room felt colder after he was gone. Eli sat very still in the bed. His good hand was gripping the blanket over his lap, the knuckles white. "Kane," he said quietly. "Yeah." "He's going to come back with Dr. Hale." "I know. Dr. Hale likes him. They went to the same college or something. Troy told me that the first day." Eli's voice was steady, but his hands were not. "He's going to make you leave," Eli said. "Isn't he?" Kane's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen. "Lyle." "Hold on," he said. He stepped into the corridor just far enough to take the call. Tell me, Kane said. Brennan came through, Lyle's voice said. He called Child Crisis Services. Different branch from DHS. Faster response. They've got a caseworker en route. Should be there within the hour. A pause. He also ran your guy, Troy Hayden. Domestic disturbance call 2 years ago at a prior address in Broken Arrow. Charges were dropped. Ex-wife filed a restraining order in 2019. Let it lapse 6 months later. Lyle's voice was flat, reciting facts. Brennan's talking to the on-call DA now about an emergency protective order. Kane leaned against the corridor wall. Down the hall, he could see Troy talking to Dr. Hale near the nursing station. Troy was gesturing. Hale was nodding. How long? Kane asked. Brennan said within the hour, maybe faster. Kane looked at his watch. 6:31. Okay, he said. Thanks, Lyle. Don't do anything stupid, Lyle said. Define stupid. Kane, I'll call you later. He hung up and walked back into room 14. Eli was exactly where he'd left him. The boy's eyes tracked Kane as he returned to the chair. Was that about me? Eli asked. Yeah. What did they say? Kane sat down. They said help is coming. How soon? Soon enough. Eli looked at the clock, then at the door, then back at Kane. What if it's not soon enough? Kane met his eyes. Then I stay here until it is. 2 minutes later, Troy and Dr. Hale appeared together. There was a different quality to Hale's authority now. It had been reinforced by Troy's presence, by the logic of the situation asserting itself. He came in like a man who had been given permission to resolve something. Patricia Cross followed them in, along with Don, the security guard. The room suddenly felt very crowded. Mr. Mercer, Hale said, his voice formal and final. I've spoken with Mr. Hayden, Eli's legal guardian, and he has formally requested that you vacate this room. If you refuse, I will contact hospital security and the Tulsa Police Department. Kane didn't stand up. Call them, he said. That's fine. Hale blinked. This was not the expected response. I want to be clear, Kane continued, keeping his voice even. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm not obstructing medical care. I'm not in violation of any law by being in this room. Eli has not asked me to leave. His legal guardian can request security or police, and I'll speak to them calmly when they get here. He paused. So let's call them. You are deliberately interfering with a patient discharge, Hale said. The discharge hasn't begun, Kane said. I'm sitting in a chair. Troy stepped forward. His reasonable mask was slipping slightly. You need to understand something, he said, his voice harder now. I don't know what story you think you've heard, but you are wrong. I love that boy. I take care of him. We've had some hard times, but we're family. And you're interfering with that. Kane looked at him steadily. If that's true, then you have nothing to worry about. What's that supposed to mean? It means if you're telling the truth, then the police coming here won't be a problem for you. Troy's face changed. The color drained slightly. His eyes went flat. You called the police? I made some calls, Kane said. You have no right. I have every right, Kane said quietly. Same as anyone who sees a child in danger. There is no danger, Hale interjected. I am the attending physician. I have examined this patient thoroughly. The injuries are consistent with the reported accident. The house doesn't have a back porch, Kane said. Hale froze. Eli told me, Kane continued. He said the story was that he fell down the back porch steps. But his house doesn't have a back porch. Does it, Troy? Troy's face went through several expressions very quickly. Anger, calculation, something that might have been fear. He's confused, Troy said. The concussion? He's not confused, Kane said. He's scared. This is absurd, Hale said, but there was something in his voice now, a crack in the certainty. Mr. Mercer, you are not qualified to make these determinations. No, Kane agreed, but the people I called are. Patricia's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her expression changed. Dr. Hale, she said quietly. There's a woman at the nurse's station from Child Crisis Services. The room went silent. Hale turned to look at her. What Child Crisis Services? Patricia repeated. A caseworker. She's asking to speak with the attending physician for Eli Hayden. A pause. And there's a Tulsa PD officer with her. Troy's face changed, not dramatically, not the way it would in a movie. It was subtler than that. A slight loss of color, a stiffening around the eyes. the micro-expression of a man who has just heard a door close on an exit he was counting on. He looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him. The boy's eyes held something new. Not relief yet, not safety, but the first faint, careful loosening of the wire that had been coiled tight in his chest for however long it had been coiled there. Troy looked at Kane. Kane met his gaze and held it. And whatever Troy saw there, whatever was in the face of a 64-year-old man who had lived a life that had made him very hard to intimidate and impossible to move when he had decided not to move, it was enough. Troy stepped back. He didn't say anything. He stepped back into the corridor, and a moment later Kane heard his footsteps, that heavy, deliberate walk moving away down the hall. Not running, not dramatic, just leaving. Dr. Hale remained in the doorway for a moment longer, his expression cycling through something complicated. Professional pride, doubt, the beginning of a realization that perhaps he had believed what was convenient rather than what was true. Then he too left. Patricia and Don followed. The room was quiet again. Kane sat down heavily in the chair. He realized his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the particular exhaustion that comes after holding a position for a long time against sustained pressure. Eli let out a breath, long and slow, the breath of a child who had been holding it for longer than a breath can reasonably be held. "Is it over?" he asked. Kane looked at him, at this small, brave boy who had survived something no child should have to survive. "It's starting to be," Kane said. The caseworker's name was Delphine Rourke. She was 45 years old with auburn hair, pulled into a tight bun, and black-framed glasses that gave her a severe appearance, softened only by the warmth in her eyes. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with the calm, focused energy of someone who had seen enough to be moved by it and still had not stopped being moved by it. She arrived at room 14 with Officer Briggs, a Tulsa PD patrol officer in his mid-30s, who had the weathered face of someone who'd worked night shifts for too long. He positioned himself in the hallway, giving Delphine space to work. Delphine introduced herself to Kane first, shaking his hand with a firm grip, then turned her attention to Eli. "Hi, Eli," she said, her voice gentle but professional. "My name is Delphine. I'm from Child Crisis Services. I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" Eli looked at Kane. Kane gave him a small nod. "Okay," Eli said quietly. "I'd like to speak with you privately if that's all right. Just you and me. Officer Briggs will be right outside the door." Eli's eyes widened slightly. Fear flickered across his face. "Can Kane stay?" he asked. Delphine considered this. "I need to talk to you alone, sweetheart. It's important that I hear your story without anyone else in the room. But Kane can wait right outside with Officer Briggs. He's not going anywhere. Right, Mr. Mercer?" "Right," Kane said. He stood up. "I'll be just outside the door, Eli. You tell her the truth, all of it." Eli nodded, though his hands gripped the blanket tighter. Kane stepped into the corridor. Officer Briggs was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, observing the hallway traffic with the bored alertness of someone used to waiting. "You the one who made the calls?" Briggs asked. "My brother did. I asked him to." Briggs looked Kane up and down. The patch, the tattoos, the age and the hardness that came with it. "You family know." "How do you know the kid?" "I don't. Met him a couple hours ago." Briggs absorbed this. "And you decided to park yourself in his room and refuse to leave?" "Yeah." "Why, Bob?" Kane looked at the officer. Briggs had tired eyes, but not cynical ones. The kind of cop who'd seen too much, but hadn't let it destroy whatever sense of duty had brought him to the job in the first place. "Because someone needed to," Kane said simply. Briggs studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, as if that answer was sufficient. They stood in silence. Down the hall, Kane could see the nursing station. Nora was there updating a card. She glanced in his direction, caught his eye, and gave the smallest nod. An acknowledgement. A thank you, maybe. Or maybe just recognition that they'd both done what they could. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The door to room 14 remained closed. Kane could hear the low murmur of voices inside. Delphine's calm questions. Eli's quieter responses. Then the door opened. Delphine stepped out. Her expression was controlled, but Kane saw the tightness around her mouth, the way her jaw was set. She looked at Briggs. "We need to contact Mercy Regional. The mother, Corinne Hayden, is a patient there. I need to coordinate with their social services immediately." "What did the kids say?" Briggs asked. "Enough." Delphine's voice was steady. "More than enough. consistent with the physical evidence and inconsistent with the reported mechanism of injury. She pulled out her phone, made a call, stepped a few feet away for privacy. Briggs looked at Kane. The stepdad, Troy Hayden, you see where he went? He left when you arrived. Walked down that hallway. Kane pointed. He say anything? No, just left. Briggs spoke into his radio requesting backup and asking dispatch to locate Troy Hayden in the hospital. Then he turned back to Kane. You're going to need to give a statement. All right. How you ended up in that room. What you observed. What the kid told you. Kane nodded. Delphine finished her call and returned. She looked at Kane directly. I need to ask you something, Mr. Mercer. Did Eli tell you anything about how he was injured? He said he fell, but the way he said it, I knew he was lying, or repeating something he'd been told to say. Did he tell you anything else? He said his house doesn't have a back porch. The story on the medical report says he fell down the back porch steps. Delphine wrote this down. Anything else? He said his mother tried to stop Troy. That's why she got hurt worse. Delphine's pen paused for just a second, then continued writing. And you stayed in the room because Kane thought about how to answer that. The real answer was too complicated, too tangled up in Roy Tasker, in Beth, in the paper in his pocket that said he was dying. Because he needed someone too, Kane said. It was the same answer he'd given Briggs. It was the only answer that mattered. Delphine looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her portfolio. We're filing for an emergency protective order tonight, she said. Eli will be placed in emergency foster care until we can stabilize his mother's situation and complete a full investigation. What about Troy? Kane asked. Officer Briggs will locate him and bring him in for questioning. Whether charges are filed will depend on the statements from Eli and his mother and the medical evidence. The doctor who cleared this as an accident, Kane said. Hale, he and Troy are friends. Troy told Eli they went to college together. Delphine's expression didn't change, but something hardened behind her eyes. I'll make a note of that, she said. She went back into the room to finish her interview. Kane remained in the hallway with Briggs. Another 10 minutes passed. Then Delphine emerged again, this time with Eli. The boy was in a wheelchair, hospital protocol for discharge. He wore sweatpants and a t-shirt someone had brought him days ago. His left arm was still in the brace. His small backpack of belongings sat in his lap. He looked at Kane. They said I can't go home, Eli said. His voice was very small. Kane knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. That's right, he said. You're going somewhere safe, somewhere Troy can't get to you. What about my mom? They're going to help her too. Eli's eyes were bright with tears he was trying very hard not to shed. I'm scared, he whispered. I know, Kane said, but you're going to be okay, I promise. How do you know? Because you were brave enough to tell the truth. That's the hardest part. Everything else gets easier from here. Eli nodded, though Kane wasn't sure the boy believed him. Delphine put a hand gently on Eli's shoulder. We're going to wait here for a little bit, she said. Someone very nice is coming to meet you. Her name is Marley. She's going to take care of you for a while. Is she nice? Eli asked. Very nice, Delphine said. She's helped a lot of kids. You're going to like her. They waited. Kane stood. His knees protested. 64 years old and kneeling on hospital linoleum. He felt every one of those years. Nora appeared from the nursing station. She had a tablet in her hands and the careful expression of someone who had just done something that might cost her. Mr. Mercer, she said quietly, can I speak with you for a moment? Kane followed her a few steps down the corridor out of earshot of Delphine and Eli. I just submitted a formal complaint about Dr. Hale, Nora said. Her voice was steady but quiet. I documented everything. The relationship between Hale and Troy Hayden. The fact that Hale dismissed my concerns without proper investigation. The fact that he was prepared to discharge Eli into an unsafe environment. Kane looked at her. You know that's going to come back on you. I know. She met his eyes. But I'd rather lose my job than let that boy go home to the man who put him here. You might not lose your job. I might. Patricia is already upset. Hale has a lot of influence here. She paused. But you were right to stay, and I was right to ask you to check on him. Sometimes doing the right thing costs something. Kane thought about the paper in his pocket, about Beth, about Roy Tasker. Yeah, he said quietly. Sometimes it does. Nora nodded once, then returned to the nursing station. 25 minutes later, Marley Sutton arrived. She was 62 years old with short silver hair and kind blue eyes. She wore jeans and a simple sweater and carried herself with the calm warmth of someone who had done this many times and still approached it with genuine care. Delphine introduced them. Marley knelt beside Eli's wheelchair with a grace that suggested this was muscle memory. "Hi, Eli," she said. Her voice was soft. "I'm Marley. I know you've had a really hard few days. I'm going to take you to my house for a while. You'll have your own room. We'll get you some dinner. And tomorrow we can talk about what happens next. Does that sound okay?" Eli looked at her warily. "Do you have a dog?" "I do. Her name is Pepper. She's very old and very lazy, and she loves kids." "Okay," Eli said, the smallest bit of tension leaving his shoulders. Marley looked at Delphine. "I have the car seat ready, and I stopped and got some things I thought he might need." She pulled a paper bag from her tote. "Some snacks, a book, just in case." "Thank you, Marley," Delphine said. Marley stood and began to push the wheelchair toward the elevator. Eli twisted around to look back at Kane. "Wait," he said. Marley stopped. Eli looked at Kane with those old, careful eyes. "Will you get in trouble?" he asked, "for staying here with your club?" Kane shook his head. "No, you're sure?" "I'm sure." Eli seemed to be working up the courage to say something else. "You have a lot of tattoos," he said finally. "I do." "Which one's your favorite?" Kane walked over to the wheelchair. He pushed up his left sleeve, careful of the bandage and the stitches underneath. On the inside of his forearm, just below the gauze, the small tattoo was visible. "Show up." Eli stared at it for a long time. "I got that one when I was 30, Kane said, "to remind myself." "Of what?" "That most of the time that's all it takes, showing up." He looked at Eli, at this small boy who had survived something that should have broken him and somehow hadn't. "You're going to be okay, Eli," Kane said. "Not right away. It's going to be hard for a while, but you're going to be okay." Eli looked at him. The wire in his chest, whatever remained of it, loosened a little further. "Okay," he said. "It came out small and uncertain, but it came out." Marley gave Kane a nod over Eli's head. A quiet acknowledgement, a thank you from one person who had shown up to another. Then she pushed the wheelchair toward the elevator, and they were gone. Kane stood in the hallway and felt the exhaustion hit him all at once. His arm throbbed where the stitches pulled. His back ached from sitting in that small plastic chair for more than 2 hours. The adrenaline that had been holding him upright drained away, leaving behind the particular weariness that comes after a crisis has passed. Officer Briggs approached him with a notepad. "I need that statement now," he said. Kane gave it. The facts, the timeline, what Eli had said, what he'd observed. Briggs wrote it all down with the methodical attention of someone who knew this paperwork mattered. When they were finished, Briggs closed his notepad. "You did a good thing tonight," he said. Kane didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded. Briggs left to continue looking for Troy Hayden. Kane was alone in the corridor. He walked to the nursing station. Nora was there finishing her shift notes. She looked up as he approached. "He's safe," Kane said. "I know. Delphine texted me." Nora set down her pen. "Thank you. You're the one who asked me to check on him. And you're the one who stayed." She looked at him directly. "Most people wouldn't have." Kane thought about that, about Roy Tasker, about all the times in his life when no one had shown up and the one time someone had. "I had a reason," he said. Nora studied him. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "When I asked you to check room 14, you could have walked out of this hospital and never looked back. No one would have blamed you. No one would have known." She held his gaze. "Why didn't you?" Kane was quiet for long enough that the question had space to breathe. "Because I know what that kid was feeling," he said finally. "Sitting in a room waiting for the person who hurt you to come back. Counting the minutes, pretending everything's fine because that's the safest thing to do." He looked down the hall toward room 14. "I know what it's like when nobody shows up," he said, "and I know what it's like when somebody does." Nora didn't say anything immediately. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "Who showed up for you?" "A man named Roy Tasker. Not a good man by most definitions, but he showed up." Kane's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've been paying that forward for a long time, in ways that probably don't look like it from the outside. No, Nora said softly. It looks exactly like that from where I'm standing. She extended her hand. Kane shook it, the same firm grip as when they'd first met. You should probably go, she said. Your shift here is done. Kane nodded. He picked up his discharge papers from the counter, where Nora had set them earlier before any of this had started. Back when he'd just been a man getting stitches for a cut on his arm. That felt like a long time ago. He walked through the hospital corridors, past the waiting room where Marcus at the front desk looked up startled to see him still there, then gave a small, uncertain nod that Kane returned. Out through the automatic doors into the October night, the cold air hit him full in the face. The parking lot was amber-lit and half-empty. Above the hospital, the Tulsa sky had cleared to a hard dark blue, the first stars appearing at the edges where the light pollution thinned. His Harley sat where he'd left it more than 6 hours ago. 6 hours. It felt like longer. Kane stood beside the bike and pulled out his phone. He found the number he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. The oncologist's office. It went to voicemail. He waited for the beep. This is Kane Mercer, he said. Patient number 47329. I want to schedule an appointment to start treatment. Call me back. He hung up. In the inside pocket of his vest, the paper with the diagnosis still sat folded in thirds. Small cell carcinoma, stage 2, 60% a 5-year survival if treated immediately. Kane had spent 2 weeks thinking about that 60%, about whether it was worth it, about what 5 more years would look like, about dying alone in a hospital room like Beth had despite everything they'd tried. He still didn't have answers to most of those questions. But standing in the parking lot of St. Michael Hospital and with Eli's face still fresh in his mind and the memory of Roy Tasker sitting heavy in his chest, Kane thought maybe the questions didn't matter as much as he'd thought. Maybe what mattered was showing up, for treatment, for whatever time he had left, for the chance to do one more good thing before the end. He put on his helmet, straddled the bike, turned the key. The engine woke up under him, familiar and steady. He sat there for a moment before pulling out. On the inside of his left forearm, under 10 new stitches, under the bandage Nora Walsh had dressed with precise and careful hands, the 2 small words held their ground in the skin, the way they had held their ground for 34 years. Show up. Kane Mercer pulled out of the St. Michael Hospital parking lot and rode north into the dark. The city of Tulsa opened up around him. Streetlights and storefronts in the quiet hum of evening traffic. He rode through neighborhoods he knew and neighborhoods he didn't, past the garage where he worked and the house where he lived alone, past all the small, ordinary pieces of a life he'd built in the spaces between violence and grief. He didn't stop. He just rode. The wind was cold against his face. His arm throbbed steadily under the bandage. He was 64 years old with cancer growing in his lungs and no one waiting for him at home. But tonight he had shown up for a boy who needed someone to stand in a room and refuse to move. And that boy was safe now, sleeping in a stranger's house with a dog named Pepper and a woman named Marley who had shown up for dozens of other kids before him. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. Kane rode until the city thinned and the lights grew sparse. Then he turned around and headed back. 6 months later, the garage in Broken Arrow smelled like motor oil and old coffee and the particular kind of male companionship that didn't require a lot of words. Lyle's shop. 3 bays, 2 lifts, shelves of parts, organized with the precision of a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands. Kane was in bay 2 elbows deep in the engine of a 73 shovelhead that someone had brought in half dead and asked him to resurrect. He'd been working on it for 2 weeks, taking his time, getting it right. His head was smooth and shining under the work lights, bald from the chemotherapy that had started 6 weeks after that night at St. Michael Hospital. 4 rounds down, 2 more to go. The doctors said it was working, the tumor was shrinking, the 60% was holding. Kane didn't think about that too much. He just showed up for the appointments and let them poison him and came home and slept and did it again 2 weeks later. The side effects were manageable. Fatigue, nausea, a strange metallic taste that never quite went away. But he was still here, still upright, still working. The bell above the shop door chimed. Kane looked up from the carburetor he was rebuilding and saw Marley Sutton standing in the doorway. And beside her, holding her hand with his left hand, because his right was still in a brace, though a much smaller one now, was Eli Hayden. The boy had grown. Not much. 6 months wasn't enough for real growth, but there was something different in his face, something that looked like the beginning of healing. Eli saw Cain and his eyes went wide. "Cain," he said, and there was real joy in his voice. Cain set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. Eli ran across the garage and threw his good arm around Cain's waist. Cain stood very still for a moment, surprised by the force of the embrace. Then he put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Hey, kid," he said quietly. Eli pulled back, looking up at him. His eyes took in the bald head the way Cain had lost the IV port visible at the base of his neck. "You're sick," Eli said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Cain said, "but I'm getting better." "You promise?" Cain thought about the doctors and their careful optimism. The scans that showed progress. The percentages that never quite reached certainty. "I'm trying," he said, which was the truth. Marley approached smiling. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by. Eli's been asking about you for weeks. We were in the area and I thought—" "It's fine," Cain said. He looked at Eli. "How are you doing?" "Good." Eli's voice was stronger than it had been. "I'm staying with Marley. Mom is—" He paused. "Mom is out of the hospital. She's in a place where she can get help. Delphine says maybe in a few months we can live together again." "That's good," Cain said. "Real good." "Troy is in jail," Eli added matter of fact. "He's going to be there for a long time." Cain nodded. He'd heard. Lyle had kept him updated. Troy Hayden had been charged with 2 counts of domestic assault and 1 count of child abuse. The evidence had been overwhelming. Eli's testimony, Corinne's testimony, the medical records, the history of prior complaints. He'd taken a plea deal, 7 years. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was something. "You back in school?" Cain asked. "Yeah, I'm in 4th grade now." Eli looked around the garage, taking in the bikes and the tools and the organized chaos of a working shop. "Is this where you work?" "Sometimes. It's my brother's place. I help out when he needs it." Eli walked over to the shovel head, studying it with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested. "Is this yours?" he asked. "No, customer bike. Guy wants it running for a rally next month." "Will you get it done?" "Yeah." Eli looked back at him. "Can I come visit you again sometime?" Cain glanced at Marley. She nodded. "Sure," Cain said. "You can come visit." Eli smiled, a real smile, the first Cain had seen from him. They stayed for another 20 minutes. Eli asked questions about the bikes. Cain answered them. Marley and Lyle talked quietly near the office, discussing logistics and schedules in the way adults do when they're trying to coordinate the care of a child who has too many people looking after him and not enough all at once. When they left, Eli hugged Cain again. "Thank you for showing up," Eli said into Cain's shirt. Cain felt something tight in his chest loosen, something that had been there for a very long time. "You're welcome," he said. He watched them drive away, Marley's sedan disappearing down the street. Then he went back to the shovelhead and picked up where he'd left off. Lyle came over wiping his hands on a rag. "That the kid from the hospital?" he asked. "Yeah. He looks good." "He does." Lyle was quiet for a moment. "You look like shit, though." Cain almost laughed. "Chemo'll do that." "You gonna make it?" "Don't know yet. Doctors say maybe." "That's better than no." "Yeah." Lyle put his hand on Cain's shoulder, just for a second, the closest either of them usually got to affection. "I'm glad you called me that night," Lyle said. "I'm glad you stayed." Cain looked at his brother, at this man who had chosen a different path and built a different life, but still showed up when it mattered. "Me too," Cain said. That evening, Cain had a chemotherapy appointment. He arrived early, checked in with the receptionist whose name he'd learned was Linda, and settled into the familiar waiting room chair. The infusion center was quieter than the hospital. Soft lighting, recliners instead of exam tables. People in various stages of treatment, some reading, some sleeping, some staring at nothing in particular. Mr. Mercer. He looked up. Nora Walsh stood into the doorway, not in scrubs this time, but in jeans and a sweater. She held 2 cups of coffee. "Nora," he said, surprised. "I work here now," she said, sitting down beside him. "Left St. Michael 3 months ago." Patricia made things difficult after that night, but it was time for a change anyway. She handed him one of the cups. "I see your name on the appointment list every 2 weeks. Thought I'd finally say hello." Cain took the coffee. "How's Eli?" "Marley sends me updates. He's doing well. Started seeing a therapist. Still asks about you. She paused. Corinne completed her program last month. She and Eli are living together again. Supervised, but together. That's good. It is. Nora looked at him. How are you holding up? Kane thought about the scans from last week. The tumor shrinking. The doctors cautiously optimistic. Still here? Still showing up, Nora said softly. He almost smiled. Yeah. They sat in comfortable silence until the nurse called his name. Nora stood with him. I'll be here next time too, she said. If that's all right. Kane nodded. It's all right. The treatment took 3 hours. Nora stayed the whole time sitting in the chair beside his recliner, reading a book, occasionally looking up to check on him. When it was over and the IV came out, she walked him to his bike. You shouldn't be riding, she said. I'll be fine. Kane. He looked at her. I've been riding since I was 16. I'm not stopping now. She shook her head but didn't argue. Be careful. Always am. No, you're not, she smiled. But you show up, and that's what matters. He put on his helmet and started the engine. Nora stepped back, raised her hand in a small wave. Kane nodded once and pulled out of the parking lot. That night, Kane went home to his small house on the east side of Tulsa. He made dinner, something simple. Soup and bread. He ate half of it before the nausea came. He sat on his back porch in the April evening, wrapped in a blanket Beth had picked out years ago, and looked at the stars. His phone buzzed. A text from Nora: drive safe. See you in 2 weeks. He typed back, made it home. Thanks for the coffee. Another text appeared. This one from Marley. Eli wanted me to tell you he got an A on his science project. He used magnets. Says you told him they were cool. Kane smiled. He couldn't remember telling Eli that magnets were cool, but it sounded like something he might have said. He texted back, tell him I'm proud of him. The stars were very bright. The air was warm and carried the smell of someone's backyard grill and freshly cut grass. And Kane Mercer, 64 years old, dying slowly but not dead, yet sat in the darkness and thought about Roy Tasker and Beth and Eli and all the moments in his life when someone had shown up. On the inside of his left forearm, under the scars and the years and the ink that had faded to blue-green, the 2 words held their ground. Show up. Kane had shown up. He would show up again in 2 weeks for the next chemotherapy appointment, and the day after that for whatever came next. Because that was what you did when you had time left and people who needed you and a reason to keep going. You showed up, and sometimes that was enough.